You see, they don't need to win.
But that is the exception and not the rule.
But they don't need to win the arguments, they just need to sow doubt. And that technique is used all the while.
Well, that was done with cigarettes for decades too.
Yeah, they just need to sow a bit of doubt, and then they think there's wiggle room to avoid the argument. Yeah, and they don't need to be consistent in most of the arguments when you look at them. Most arguments about most things, actually, are. Somebody once said that if you know anything about a particular subject, you'll always see it misrepresented in the media. In those days it was called newspapers, they said. And if you know about a particular subject and you read it in the newspaper, you'll see how wrongly it's reported. And it's generally true, because the media needs, it needs a bit of dissent, it needs a bit of argument. And so someone can come up with an argument that might be valid in a small way, but be deeply flawed, and it just gives a little bit of room for doubt. And that's the technique they use.
There's a point, I think, in veganism where the thought of eating an animal or eating animal product also does become quite a gross thought. That moment where you do start thinking, that's actually quite repulsive, the idea of putting that flesh in my mouth or that animal secretion in my mouth, it becomes quite a gross thought. And I know now that I will never, ever want to put any animal products in my mouth ever again.
Yeah.
Do you think that in your lifetime or my lifetime, say, that the world will transition to becoming a much more vegan world?
These revolutions do happen and we don't notice them. The internet came along and transformed everything, and yet we don't think that we've lived through revolutions. We still think we're living in a pretty much the same world we were, but we're really not. I can remember the first email I sent or received. And, the world before that was a different place. And so if these things can happen and be that transformative, I could imagine it happening. And once it gathers pace, then it really gallops along, and before you know where you are, the whole world is different, and then you'll wonder how you ever lived that way before. They're saying we live without, wonder how anyone lived without the internet. And with the phones, how ubiquitous they were. I remember the high streets being transformed and every other shop was a phone shop.
What, selling mobiles?
Yeah, I remember seeing it happen. So I could see something like that happening, and if it does happen, it will probably happen, reach a sort of tipping point and happen. I don't know whether you remember, I think it was the restaurant at the end of the universe when they'd bred a cow. It was something like a cow.
Is this in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Yeah, it was that series, in which it was bred to want to be killed for meat, and they wheeled it out into the restaurant, and it was offering bits of itself to the diners, and then it was happy to be killed and eaten. It was very powerful, and it's worth looking into, worth looking up.
That's interesting.
And of course Dawkins was friends with
the author of Hitchhikers,
whose name escapes me at the moment. Anyway, they were friends, and you can see the playoff between. Sometimes you can see in Dawkins's work a reference to that, and in the Hitchhiker series you can see references to Dawkins. But yes, that was a very clever way of pointing it out, and that stuck with me.
Even when this is back when you used to eat.
Oh yeah, it's a long while ago.
And you obviously remember it clearly.
Yeah, and comedy and satire like that can highlight things that no amount of ranting or attempting to convert will do, and it will just sit there in your mind, eating away at you. A little parasite in your head. So that was very clever. Yeah.
And meat should be very expensive, more expensive than it is. A piece of steak should cost treble what it does, but because of the funding and the taxpayers' money going into it, it becomes affordable. Same with fishing.
Oh yeah.
Fishing vessels are subsidised by the government too. And almost all antibiotics, the majority of antibiotics, go into animal agriculture. That is where they get used. People think it's because of the over-prescription of antibiotics by doctors to humans, but really most of the antibiotics are being given to animals.
Well, it's horrible for the animals, there's no question. It's also very dangerous for diseases. You've got all these monocultures.